Imagine a world where the lights go out, not because of a storm, but because of a signature. In October 1973, the most powerful nations on Earth were brought to a grinding halt without a single shot being fired at their borders. Within weeks, the American dream was sitting in a 2-mile-long gas line. Christmas lights were extinguished by executive order. The global economy, the most complex machine ever built, began to seize up like an engine without oil. For decades, we believed the fuel for our civilization was infinite. We were wrong. In a matter of days, the price of the world's most vital resource quadrupled. Power shifted from the skyscrapers of New York to the sands of the Middle East, and the West realized it was a hostage to its own addiction. This wasn't just a shortage, it was an ambush that reshaped every car you drive, every price you pay, and every war we've fought since. This is the story of the day the Earth stood still. This is the 1973 oil shock. Part 1. The Illusion of Abundance. The Gilded Age of the V8 and the Ghost of Infinite Growth. The year is 1965. In the suburbs of Detroit, London, and Tokyo, the air smells of leaded gasoline and optimism. To the average citizen of the post-war West, the future isn't just bright, it is fueled by an inexhaustible, invisible river of black gold. Imagine a world where a gallon of gas costs less than a loaf of bread. A world where efficiency is a word reserved for factory floors, not engines. This was the era of the Great Acceleration. Since the end of World War II, the global economy had expanded at a rate never before seen in human history. This expansion was built on a single, shaky pillar, oil at $3 a barrel. At this moment in history, the West was addicted, but it was a comfortable addiction. In the United States, the interstate highway system was carving through the landscape, encouraging millions to move to the suburbs. These suburbs required cars, and those cars, massive, chrome-plated beasts like the Cadillac Eldorado, drank fuel as if the Earth were a bottomless well. But who controlled the well? Since the early 20th century, the global oil trade was a private club. It was governed by the Seven Sisters, a group of Anglo-American oil giants including Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, and British Petroleum. These companies didn't just extract oil, they dictated the sovereignty of nations. They functioned as a shadow government, deciding how much oil would be pumped and at what price it would be sold. To the Seven Sisters, the Middle East was not a collection of ancient cultures or rising political powers. It was a gas station with a very long lease. In the palaces of Riyadh and the offices of Kuwait City, a quiet resentment was festering. The host nations, the people who actually lived above the oil, received only a fraction of the profits. They watched as their natural wealth built the skyscrapers of New York and the autobahns of Germany, while they remained developing nations. The mystery of 1973 begins here, in this lopsided power dynamic. The West felt entitled to cheap oil. The East felt robbed of their future. It was a pressure cooker with no safety valve. The Western world was living in a dream state, ignoring the fact that their entire civilization was built on a resource they did not own and a political stability they could not guarantee. Historians often look back at this period as the lull before the storm. There were warnings, of course. In 1965, nations met in Baghdad to form OPEC. At the time, the Seven Sisters laughed. They called it a paper tiger. They believed that the Arab world was too fractured, too divided by tribalism and Cold War interests, to ever stand united. They were wrong. The illusion of abundance was so thick that even as U.S. domestic oil production peaked in 1970, a terrifying milestone known as Hubbard's Peak, the public didn't blink. They simply imported more. By 1973, the U.S. was importing 36% of its oil. The trap was set. The world was waiting for a spark. And that spark would come not from an economic ledger, but from the heat of a desert war. Part 2. The Spark in the Desert. October 1973, when geopolitics met the gas pump. October 6, 1973. It was the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. As silence fell over Israel, the roar of jet engines and the thunder of artillery broke the peace. In a coordinated surprise attack, Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal while Syrian tanks hammered at the Golan Heights. The world held its breath. This wasn't just another regional skirmish. This was a high-stakes gamble in the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was backing the Arab coalition with everything it had. If Israel fell, the Middle East would tilt permanently toward Moscow. In Washington, President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger faced a nightmare scenario. Israel was running out of ammunition. Their backs were against the wall. On October 12th, Nixon made a fateful decision. He ordered Operation Nickel Grass, a massive round-the-clock airlift of military supplies to Israel. He famously told his aides, "Send everything that can fly." But the Arab nations had warned the West, "Do not intervene." On October 16, 1973, the oil ministers of the Gulf states met in Kuwait. They weren't just there to discuss prices, they were there to discuss survival. They realized that their oil was more powerful than any Soviet missile. If the West provided the hardware for the war, the Arab world would provide the software for an economic collapse. The announcement was chilling in its simplicity. The Arab members of OPEC announced they would cut oil production by 5% immediately and continue to cut it by 5% every month until their political goals were met. The next day, the oil weapon was fully unsheathed. Angered by the continued U.S. support for Israel, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, traditionally a staunch U.S. ally, did the unthinkable. He announced a total embargo on oil shipments to the United States. The shockwaves were instantaneous. This wasn't just a price hike, it was a physical severance of the world's most vital artery. The timing was perfect. The Northern Hemisphere was heading into winter. The world's stockpiles were low. The Seven Sisters were suddenly powerless. The paper tiger of OPEC had grown teeth, and it was biting hard. Inside the White House, the mood was funereal. Kissinger realized that the geopolitics of the 20th century had just shifted on its axis. Power was no longer just about who had the biggest nuclear arsenal. It was about who controlled the flow of energy. The desert kingdoms had realized that by turning a few valves in the sand, they could bring the most powerful industrial machines in history to a grinding halt. This was the moment the oil shock became a reality. The price of a barrel of oil, which had been $3.29 before the war, began a vertical climb that would not stop until it hit nearly $12. To a modern observer, $12 sounds like a bargain. But in 1973, that 300% increase was a cardiac arrest for the global economy. The spark in the desert had ignited a fire that would burn through the heart of the Western world for the next decade. The era of the unlimited was over. The era of scarcity had begun. Part 3. The Great Panic. The Winter of Discontent and the Death of the American Road. As November 1973 bled into December, the reality of the embargo hit the Western consumer like a physical blow. For decades, the car had been more than a tool in America. It was a symbol of freedom, a rite of passage, and a moving living room. Suddenly, that symbol was a liability. The panic didn't start at the government level. It started at the corner gas station. As the supply of crude oil plummeted, the Seven Sisters began to prioritize their dwindling stocks. Gasoline stations across the United States, Europe, and Japan began to run dry. It started with shorter hours. Then, the no gas signs appeared, stark, hand-painted plywood boards that signaled the end of an era. The psychological impact was profound. In a nation built on the open road, the road was suddenly closed. For the first time since the rationing of World War II, the American public felt a sense of genuine, systemic vulnerability. Long, serpentine lines of cars, sometimes stretching for miles, became a permanent fixture of the landscape. Drivers would wake up at 4 a.m. just to secure a spot in line, sitting for hours with engines off to save every drop of fuel. Tensions reached a breaking point. Fistfights broke out at pumps. In some states, gas station vigilantes began to patrol the lines to prevent line jumpers. The government, desperate to manage the chaos, introduced the odd-even rationing system. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days. It was a bureaucratic attempt to manage a physical shortage, but it only deepened the sense of national malaise. President Nixon, already beleaguered by the burgeoning Watergate scandal, went on national television to announce Project Independence. He lowered the national speed limit to 55 miles per hour, a move that felt like a betrayal to the high-speed culture of the 1960s. He asked Americans to turn down their thermostats to 68 degrees, 20 to the power of Cirque C, and to stop using Christmas lights. The crisis wasn't just limited to the fuel tank. Because oil is the feedstock for the modern world, the panic spread to every sector. The price of plastic, derived from petroleum, soared. The cost of fertilizer tripled, sending food prices into a vertical climb. In the United Kingdom, the government was forced to implement a 3-day week to conserve electricity, as coal miners went on strike alongside the oil shortage. For months, British citizens worked by candlelight, their television broadcasts cutting off at 10:30 p.m. to save power. The mystery of this period lies in how quickly the First World reverted to a state of primitive survival. It proved that the complexity of modern civilization was its greatest weakness. One missing ingredient, oil, had the power to turn a superpower into a collection of shivering households and angry commuters. The Great Panic was the moment the West realized it was no longer the master of its own destiny. Part 4. The Silent Architect, Zaki Yamani, the man who held the world's pulse. In the midst of this global chaos, one figure emerged as the undisputed protagonist of the crisis, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. As the Saudi oil minister, Yamani was not merely a politician, he was the grand master of a geopolitical chessboard. Yamani was the antithesis of the angry revolutionary. Educated at Harvard and NYU, he was a man of impeccable tailoring, soft-spoken English, and a razor-sharp intellect. While Western media often portrayed the Arab oil ministers as oil sheiks holding the world to ransom, Yamani was playing a far more sophisticated game. He understood a fundamental truth that many of his peers in OPEC did not. If you raise the price of oil too high, you destroy your customers. If you destroy your customers, you destroy yourself. Yamani's goal was not the destruction of the West, but the total recalibration of the relationship between the producer and the consumer. Behind the scenes, Yamani was the silent architect of the New World Order. He managed a delicate balance. On one hand, he had to satisfy the radical elements within OPEC, countries like Libya and Iraq, who wanted to use the oil weapon to crush the Western economy entirely. On the other hand, he was maintaining a secret channel of communication with Henry Kissinger. The mystery of Yamani lies in his foresight. He famously said, "The Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of stones, and the oil age will not end because we run out of oil." He knew that high prices would eventually force the West to find alternatives, be it nuclear, coal, or North Sea oil. Therefore, he used the 1973 shock as a surgical strike. He wanted to raise prices just enough to ensure Saudi Arabia's wealth for generations, but not so much that the world transitioned away from oil prematurely. Throughout 1974, Yamani became the most famous man in the world. He was the only person who could move the global stock markets with a single sentence. His shuttle diplomacy between Riyadh, Vienna, and Washington was more influential than any military deployment. Yamani's greatest achievement during this period was the nationalization of Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company. He did not do it through a violent coup or a sudden seizure of assets. Instead, he negotiated a, quote, participation agreement, slowly buying out the American oil giants until Saudi Arabia owned the means of production on its own soil. He was the man who took the Seven Sisters to school. By the time the 1973 shock began to stabilize, the power had shifted. The boardrooms of New York and London were no longer the centers of the energy world. The center was now a quiet, bearded man in a Riyadh office, watching the ticker tape of a world he had helped reshape. Part 5. The Economic Shadow, Stagflation. The monster that rewrote the rules of capitalism. By early 1974, the gas lines began to thin, but a much darker shadow was falling over the global economy. For decades, the world had followed the Keynesian consensus. If the economy slowed down, you lowered interest rates and spent money to create jobs. If the economy grew too fast and caused inflation, you reined it in. It was a seesaw that had worked perfectly since 1945. Then came the oil shock, and the seesaw snapped in half. The world was introduced to stagflation, a portmanteau of stagnation and inflation. It was a phenomenon that economists previously thought was mathematically impossible. How could prices be skyrocketing while unemployment was also rising? Usually, high unemployment meant people had less money to spend, which kept prices low. But oil was the universal input. When the cost of energy tripled, the cost of everything else followed suit, regardless of how many people were out of work. In the United States and Europe, the golden age of capitalism ended with a shudder. The cost of a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and a winter coat began to climb by 10%, then 12%, then 15% annually. Savings accounts were eaten alive by the eroding value of currency. In the UK, inflation hit a staggering 24% in 1975. The mystery of stagflation was its resilience. It wasn't a temporary spike. It was a structural rot. Industrial giants like Chrysler and British Leyland hovered on the brink of bankruptcy. The Rust Belt began to form as factories, unable to afford the massive energy bills required to run heavy machinery, began to shutter their doors forever. The social contract was breaking. Labor unions demanded higher wages to keep up with inflation, which forced companies to raise prices even further to cover the wage hikes, a vicious wage-price spiral. The psychological toll was a sense of profound helplessness. The post-war generation, raised on the promise of onward and upward, was suddenly told to do more with less. This era gave birth to the Miser Index, a simple sum of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. By the mid-70s, the misery index was at record highs, and the mood of the West was one of cynical exhaustion. Conclusion: the end of innocence. The 1973 oil shock was more than a temporary disruption of the status quo. It was the funeral for the 20th century's greatest delusion, the idea that resources were infinite and that progress was guaranteed. When the lights flickered in the winter of 1973, the world caught a glimpse of a fragile reality. We learned that the comfort of the West was built on a foundation of sand, managed by a handful of men in a few rooms in Vienna and Riyadh. The era of the open road and the big engine didn't just slow down, it hit a wall of geopolitical reality from which it would never truly recover. But in that darkness, a new world was forged. The crisis forced us to think, to innovate, and to conserve. It gave birth to the environmental movements that now define our global agenda. It forced architects to build for the sun, and engineers to build for efficiency. It taught us that energy security is not a luxury, but the very heartbeat of national survival. As we stand today on the precipice of a new energy revolution, moving from the age of carbon to the age of electrons, the echoes of 1973 are louder than ever. We are once again navigating the treacherous waters of supply chains, resource monopolies, and the shifting power of nations. The players have changed, and the technology has evolved, but the fundamental truth remains. Those who control the flow of energy control the course of history. The 1973 oil shock was a warning shot across the bow of civilization. It reminded us that we are all passengers on a very small, very interconnected planet. It taught us that the price of our modern life is a constant, delicate balance of power. As the credits roll on this chapter of history, the question is no longer when the oil will run out, but whether we have learned enough from the first great shock to survive the next. The history of the 1973 oil shock isn't just a story of the past, it is the blueprint for our future.